start today, I just want to warn you that today's topic may be a bit raw for some of our listeners, because we're going to be talking about the effect of complaints and adverse outcomes on clinicians. So look, if you're feeling a bit fragile at the moment, maybe now is not the time to listen to this, or maybe make sure that you're in the right headspace to continue. So welcome to Reducing Risk, a series of podcasts from Medical Protection created specifically for clinicians in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Reducing Risk looks at key medical legal issues in our jurisdiction and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to manage these risks. My name is Dr. Lucy Gibbard, and I'm one of the medical legal advisors at MPS, and today we are lucky to be joined by Mr. Adam Holloway, one of the partners at our panel law firm, Wood & Kearney. Hello, Adam.
Hi, Lucy.
And I'm also grateful to be joined by my colleague, Dr. Sam King, who's one of the other medical legal advisors at MPS. Hello, Sam.
Hey, Lucy.
And we also have Tim Cookson, a recently retired medical legal consultant. Great to see you, Tim.
Hi, Lucy.
So look, we spend a lot of time in our podcast talking about HDC cases and when things have gone wrong, and medical counsel statements and how doctors can be held accountable. But recently I've had cause to really think about the adverse effect that having a complaint has had on us as individual doctors. I've had complaints and I know how bad I felt. And as part of our role as medical legal advisors, we often talk to doctors who are really struggling with the impact that having had a complaint has had on their lives. We hear the tears and listen to the distress of our colleagues, and sometimes we think, well, it's great that patients have rights, but do doctors have rights as well? I think it's something we probably don't acknowledge enough, and something that maybe the HDC and the regulators don't really accept either. Clinicians are people too, and sometimes it just all gets too much. Our jobs as clinicians are filled with day-to-day stress of addressing patient needs and dealing with uncertainty in diagnosis and coping with under-resourcing, constant pressure of inbox and results, long hours, little thanks. And then when you get a complaint on top of all that, it can just be the last straw. Over the years that I've worked for MPS, I've talked to many members who've considered giving up medicine or have actually done so as a result of a complaint. And as we know, both here and overseas, doctors have actually ended their lives. So today we're here to acknowledge the problem and to talk about how complaints can impact us, and then hopefully provide some acknowledgement and support. And we are going to go on in our next podcast to talk about things that we can do to hopefully make things better.
Yeah, I think this is a really important topic. It's almost along the lines of physician, heal thyself. If we can't look after ourselves, then in the long run, we aren't going to be able to look after our patients either. So I'm really glad that we're discussing this today.
Yeah, and discussing it, talking about it is actually really important. If you've had a complaint, it really helps to normalise the complaint by talking to people. And we, some time ago, did a survey at MPS, and we asked our members who'd had a complaint, what was the most valuable resource that they had in helping them manage that complaint? And it was actually colleagues. In fact, surprisingly, colleagues were more helpful than family even. So getting over that hurdle and, talking to someone is actually really, really important. We'll find that our colleagues do understand and are not judgmental. I think that's the thing we're afraid of, is that we talk about when we've made a mistake, we'll be judged immediately.
Yeah, you feel like you're the worst doctor in the world, and it's not easy to talk about mistakes, and we often don't. And then, of course, we don't get the support we need. I remember some advice I was given when I started out about sharing mistakes with colleagues, and I was told that when you think you've done the worst thing in the world and missed a completely obvious diagnosis or prescribed completely the wrong medication, when you share it with a colleague, that normally helps because they can always tell you something that they've done worse. And I think that's, maybe not worse, but they can often share and help normalise the distress that you're feeling, and they don't tend to judge you, even if we feel we will be judged. So in looking at this, I've tried to divide it up into the different scenarios. And the first scenario I wanted to look at was when we're going to consider when there's a complaint that's come in after we have actually made a mistake or something has gone wrong in that patient's care. And ironically, for most of us, the complaints that come after we've made a mistake can actually sometimes be easier to deal with. doctors, we're often our own worst critics. And when we've missed a cancer diagnosis or prescribed the wrong medication or done the wrong operation, in fact, we tend to often be more critical of ourselves than the patient is.
I think that's right. I think we are very critical of ourselves. That's my observation in the way that in dealing with our members. And I think that if the complaint is justified, we can also feel like this is our due process. It's like we need to do penance and this is part of our penance. And somehow the process can seem more fair, if you like.
Yeah, and when we've genuinely made a mistake, I think all doctors will feel really bad. There's no question about it. That's the normal response. And so acknowledging that, and, of course, if we've done the open disclosure and all the other things that are obviously subjects of other podcasts, we've done that process, but we still will regard a complaint as being a fair process as opposed to an unfair process. And I think that's really important in terms of the emotional impact that a complaint might have on us.
I have had some members where it's been so hard for them to deal with the fact that they've made an error, that they've been in complete denial that they've made an error. And I do remember one case where the member, who was originally from overseas, essentially in the middle of a case, packed up and left New Zealand to go back home. And I think it was because they had such a hard time dealing with the fact that they'd made a significant error and a patient had died.
Yeah, certainly for hopefully a relatively small group of doctors, it's the losing face that is just so incredibly important. And, I've certainly had cases where really important stuff was going on. The member was in front of disciplinary tribunals and yet still hadn't told their wife that this was going on, because that meant losing face to the family. And that's pretty tough if you're having to try and live with that kind of process on your own.
And it's that feeling of guilt as well, when you know you have done something that has caused harm to somebody else. Nobody ever goes to work wanting that to happen or thinking that will happen. We've all spent years and years training to try and help people. And so the guilt of when you know that actually you have done something to harm somebody, or that your actions have contributed to that, can be very significant and very hard to deal with when that's not what our intention ever was, or what our vision of ourselves is.
And certainly then there's that huge impact on your work following that, isn't there? You become so afraid that you're going to make the same mistake again, or some other equally significant mistake, that you then struggle to make any decisions and start practicing medicine defensively, start actually causing harm because you're doing unnecessary investigations or treating people inappropriately. So the whole series of ramifications that can come from that scenario. And I think it's important when we think about the impacts of complaints in this scenario to, be aware that there's the two aspects. There's the impact of the event, and then on top of that, there's the impact of the complaint itself and the process of a complaint. One of the things that we've all experienced as we've talked to members is that many of our members have a complete doomsday feel about a complaint from the HDC. And one of their first questions is, am I going to be struck off? And it's obviously one of our roles as advisors is to actually say, well, looking at the information that I've got, I think that's highly unlikely. Or hopefully not the converse, but every now and then, as Sam was saying, there are people who are in denial. And one of our roles is to actually point out the vulnerabilities and get them to kind of shift approach to recognize the situation.
One of the things I do think is, I'm thinking back to a complaint that I had, which just about paralyzed me. And I took 3 days before I told my husband about it, But actually that whole thing of, can you work after you've had a big mistake or a big complaint? And actually, should people have time off? Because I think there's often that kind of soldier on attitude, but I don't know, what do you guys think? Do you think if you're feeling like that, whether actually you take time off, do you think?
I often ask members that very question. Do you think you can keep working? Because what you don't want is to make another clinical error. And for some members, I think they feel better working because it distracts them from thinking about what's happened. But for others, I think that it's important they take time off. You know, if you've got a doctor who's crying on the end of the phone, I think that's a reasonable indication that they probably shouldn't be at work. So I think we do need to think about that a bit more perhaps than we have done in the past.
Yeah, and I think that whole thing, if it may feel better for them to be at work, but if they're not functioning very well, it's probably better for the patients that they're not, if they're really not functioning very well. So I think and maybe it is something that they need to not make that decision themselves, but actually go and see their GP if they're struggling and actually talk to their GP about what the right thing to do is.
And also the impact on the other members of the team. And it may be actually better for the team for that person not to be there than for the team to have to deal with a dysfunctional team member that they're having to support as well as looking after the patients.
And
is it ever the case when that, as well as taking time off work, and I agree, for some people that may not be helpful, that will just provide space to ruminate. But advice that I find myself giving from time to time is to ask whether or not someone who seems to me that they're struggling with a complaint has thought about seeing a psychologist or getting some psychological supervision in relation to what's happened. And that takes time, and I'm sure people wouldn't want to take so much time off that they can, have a whole number of sessions. But starting that sort of thing and having an outlet to look forward to in a fortnight's time or what have you could, for some people, be quite helpful. And I was just interested, does that come up when you're talking to members that that's an option?
Yes, is the answer to that. And certainly, if I recognise that someone's feeling significantly stressed, that's one of the questions is, look, we have a counselling service available. Would you like to use it? It's confidential. I won't know about whether you're accessing the counselling service, but it's there. And in fact, we've shown through surveys that we've done that the process is helpful, and we can prove that having counselling is a useful process for them.
One of the things I often talk to members about is the fact that one mistake doesn't destroy a career, because as Tim said, most people think they're going to get struck off and they feel like it's the end of the road for them in medicine. And so I often talk to them to try and give them some perspective that, if you've worked for 10 years, think of the thousands of people you've helped and that you've done a fantastic job for. And one clinical error, even if it ends in serious adverse outcomes, can't destroy all of that, although it feels like it does at the time. I think it's much harder if you're early in your career. I did have a complaint early in my career as a GP, and when you don't have that perspective because you've only been working a short time, I think it's harder. I think it's harder for young doctors to get through these things.
I think it's also much harder if the adverse outcome for your patient has been more severe. So if somebody's died or been, or if the outcome is really poor for the patient, I think, there are so many professions where the outcome, if you make an accounting error or something, actually it's money. Whereas for medicine, when there's an error, it's somebody's life. And that's, for most of us, the impact on how we feel about ourselves when we've actually impacted somebody else's life negatively is huge.
Yep, and I can certainly think of, fortunately, only a relatively small number, but of patients who have died as a result of either my actions or inactions. None of them led to complaints, but I think about those more than I do about the complaints that I've received, because they're the ones that really had an impact.
It is. It's interesting. I was reading an article about the fact that doctors and patients actually can often feel the same after medical errors, that, doctors often feel guilty and afraid and alone, but so do the patients actually. And I think, we're thinking today about the effect on doctors, but I do think we always have to have as well that actually there's a patient as well there. There's somebody else there that we need to think about and what the impact on them is as well.
It's really interesting and helpful to hear your guys' perspectives, both as medico legal consultants, but of course as practicing, clinicians who have practiced or are practicing and had complaints. And I think in a way it's encouraging that what I'm hearing, the sorts of conversations you're having with members are similar to what we do as lawyers. And it also I think tells me that sometimes people who are distressed need to hear the same thing a few times over before it sinks in. Because very regularly the conversations we find ourselves having in cases that are referred to lawyers, similar to what Sam said, by trying to put things in perspective, both in relative terms. So, this sort of error is not at the worst end of the spectrum. We see worse. I think some people find that helpful. Being reminded that this is one moment in a day or a life or a career, and it shouldn't become or devalue all the other things that you've done. But also just trying to provide a bit of certainty or understanding about what the road ahead looks like. And I think that can be really helpful to say, look, there is a process. Often it's a long process, but here's the next step and here's the next step. And we can, as lawyers, in most cases, be relatively confident in expressing advice about saying the end point of this road is not you having to stop work. Based on what we know, even on a worst case scenario, it's far less than that. And I think people can find that encouraging to have a bit of an understanding of what the next 6 months or a year looks like and what the endpoints look like realistically, because only in the rarest of cases are we looking at the possibility of being deregistered.
And I actually think that's one other thing, is that it makes it really important that people do contact their indemnifier early, because actually your indemnifier is part of your support system, your consultants like Sam and Tim and I, and the lawyers. And actually often there's a reticence, and it is sometimes that whole thing, not wanting to tell your colleagues, not wanting to tell your family. You don't want to tell the indemnifier either. And actually the sooner you do, then you can access this support. So I think it's really important. And we are going to talk at in our next podcast a little bit more about what we can do to help. So we are going to go there. But I think it's really important to think about calling your indemnifier early if there's a problem.
Not to mention the dangers that come with, for example, writing a response to the HDC without getting assistance, and then
at a time when you're feeling guilty and awful, and you might
and saying things that actually weren't terribly helpful for your
in
situation.
The long run. Yep. Absolutely. So the next scenario I would like us to consider is when you haven't made a mistake, but there has still been an adverse outcome for the patient and their whānau. And there's been a complaint. And this is actually probably a really common scenario, that something's gone wrong. And because of that, often the patient or their family feel there must be someone to blame. And although there isn't actually an error as such, a complaint comes in because the patient or their family or whānau feel like there's somebody's to blame. It may be that a patient has had an unexpected reaction to a medication, or where there's been a complication of surgery, but look, not due to a failure or an error in the part of the surgeon or the physician. So do you think doctors react differently to a complaint in this situation?
I think that doctors feel guilty even though they haven't made an error. And I think all of us, when you have a poor outcome, all of us examine the care that we've provided. And so often we can feel like we have contributed to it in some way, even though we haven't. So I think we have a very skewed view of our own care. And I think that's why it's important to get perspective from another colleague, because they can often tell you, actually, no, your care was great. There's nothing wrong with what you did. I would have done the same thing.
And there's another side, though, in that often those complaints feel really unfair. And I think we've all got a kind of an innate sense of our own innate sense of fairness. And where that's egregiously breached, it makes us feel really angry. And, so you get all those negative kind of things, quite apart from the guilt that you might have that the patient had a bad outcome. And in fact, sometimes that then overwhelms that feeling, and all you feel is the negative bits towards the patient or the complainant, as opposed to what we might otherwise feel.
And you might get very defensive in that situation because you haven't made an error, and it kind of gets your hackles up a bit, and you become quite defensive. And actually that isn't necessarily very helpful, but it's often how you feel, like, I didn't do anything wrong. How am I being attacked? And you feel the family's anger or the patient's anger. And that actually, creates a defensiveness in you.
I had that experience as a GP, but also while I was a medico-legal consultant, of a complaint that arose out of a consultation at the after hours, which is an inherently risky kind of scenario. And the child ended up being absolutely fine, but became quite sick over the intervening days from when I saw the child to when the child was admitted to hospital. But what really made me incensed about the complaint, and it really changed how I felt about the whole scenario, was that in the complaint letter it said both my GP and the hospital specialist said that my child should have been admitted on Friday night when you saw them. And that really got to me. I wasn't angry with the family. I understood why they were upset and why they might think, yes, something should have been done early. But that thought that someone might have actually, made that criticism without knowing the scenario when I saw that child, I found incredibly unfair. And it certainly created a very negative kind of feeling in me.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, very understandable, Tim, and as a sidebar, perhaps it's worth all doctors reflecting on the wisdom of offering those sorts of opinions in an offhand way, because of course you're hearing the facts as they are presented by the family, and it's probably easy if you do that sort of thing quickly or with a desire to help the family in front of you, to not realise the impact that can have, both in terms of how complaints process, but also at a personal level. Lucy, that sort of range of emotions of anger and things that people experience, all very real, and I in a way not wrong to experience those. I think what it's good to guard against is holding on to that, so that the process that then follows to examine this complaint makes you feel like a victim, or that every step along that process becomes a heightened and negative thing. And I think those are the members that I see who struggle the most, where they think the complaint is unfair, but then they think the process is very victimizing, and every time they're asked to explain what happened in a letter, it becomes a really big deal for them. And I think perhaps getting help or talking to psychologists it can be helpful, not only for cases where you think, oh my gosh, I did something wrong, but also where you're experiencing those feelings. The sort of advice we give, and I don't know if it works or if it's helpful or not, but is almost to try and interpose ourselves as lawyers and say, look, in as much as possible, let us deal with it, because it's obviously very challenging for you. We will need to talk to you. We will need to ask you questions, but I want you just to put this in a box and try and make it as small as possible in your life and get on with doing your job, and just know that someone competent is handling it. Because the complaint doesn't seem to have merit, but if you fixate on it, on the HDC victimizing you, then that's going to be a much bigger part of your thoughts in your life than it needs to be. So I think that's a strategy that can be helpful for some people.
I'm really grateful to the lawyers that we have at Watton County, because I think that you guys do that very well, putting yourself between the complainant or the HDC or the medical council and our members, and being able to help them through it with perspective like that. I think for a lot of our members, it saves them a lot of angst.
Yeah. And I think when something has gone wrong, and there's been a complaint, actually being open in your communication, and that's what you're saying. Don't let the feelings actually create an issue in the process, because if you can be open and reflective, it comes across so much better, doesn't it? And the outcome is likely to be easier for everyone, the patient included, if the doctor can have that open, reflective attitude when there's been an adverse outcome, rather than becoming defensive.
Yeah, I agree, and to have that perspective that this process is not personal to me. They haven't picked me out to force me through this thing that feels unfair. This is just the system that we have, with all its good bits and its bad bits. It's a professional expectation or professional reality that we have to engage with it, and work through its steps, even if we think that this particular complaint doesn't have merit. The people, and this is another thing I say to members, the people who are making these decisions, to roll on to the next step of the process, they are not your colleagues. They are not doctors who are thinking, oh gosh, this looks like there might be some substance here. These are, and I don't mean this at all disrespectfully, they're doing a good job, the job they're paid to do, but they sometimes quite young, sometimes, sort of either early career or mid-career public servants or people with law degrees. So you can't get angry at them for doing their jobs. The metrics or criteria that they're applying are completely divorced from what you might be feeling about whether or not the thing has any clinical legs.
Yeah, I think one of the problems, though, is when the outcome for the patient is very bad, even when the cause of the outcome is not a medical error, it does sometimes feel like the HDC want to hold someone accountable and blame someone, and it does feel like sometimes they get down to the absolute minutiae of clinical care. Even though the actual outcome wasn't caused by an error, they start nitpicking about things that really weren't the cause of the outcome. I don't know whether you guys ever feel that, because I know our members sometimes do, that actually they start talking about very, very minor issues. And it feels like they're wanting to criticize because the outcome was bad.
I think those are the hardest cases, aren't they? Where a complaint's made because a patient's passed away, perhaps, and the HDC says, we've looked at this and we've decided that the care you provided had nothing to do with this death, but we found this other thing that we think you could have done better. That's got nothing to do with what happened. That's the hardest. But again, if you can get this perspective, it's not personal. If you lock a lawyer in a room with a whole bunch of facts and literally their job description is try and find things which appear to have happened contrary to guidelines you might be able to locate online, they'll do it. That's what they've been told to do and trained to do. There's a lesson there for both sides, I think, for the HDC in realising how affecting this can be, but also for the people subject to these processes, us, the members, to realise it's not surprising, because it is a bunch of lawyers that we're up against, and that's their job.
But I guess the question that arises from that is, just because they can do it, does that mean that they should do it? And what often seems to us is that there's a lack of kind of an overall picture of what's going on. And so often those doctors who are criticised may have had very little to do with the care. The error or the main incident that occurred was under the care of somebody else, but because they're named in the complaint, then everything they write gets examined, and they're criticised for the notes not being full enough, or that the consent process hadn't been completely documented in the way that it should have been. Something that really was completely ancillary to the main event, but still has a huge impact on the doctor because of the process that the HDC follows.
I do tell members that it's very rare for any doctor to get away without some comment being made. And when we go to work, I'm sure that we don't stick to gold standard guidelines all the time for everything we do. Sometimes my notes are probably not quite up to scratch. Sometimes, I forgot to tell the patient about this side effect from this medication. None of us work perfectly any of the time. And so I try to give our members perspective from that point of view. So if the HDC come out with some minor criticism, I would ignore it, frankly, from that point of view. Don't take it too seriously, because that's what the HDC do. They nitpick.
But as a doctor, that feels so bad being criticised, doesn't it? That is the whole thing, though, isn't it? That and you lose your enjoyment of your job, and it impacts you in all sorts of ways. Where we're saying here, oh, it's minor, but actually it doesn't feel minor. It doesn't feel like that. And we often have those comments from our members that, it feels unfair, and it feels like the expectations of society and everyone are so high that doctors are going to go and do a perfect job all the time, and it's unrealistic.
It's an amazing. Well, amazing is not the right word. It's a fascinating to reflect on just the different perspectives. That from a doctor's perspective, the most important thing is outcome. That you've promoted your patient's well-being, that your patient feels good about what's happened, how you got there in a way, if that's where you got to, or that the role you played in the course of care, didn't result in any harm. That's understandably the perspective that a doctor has. And so why would you be criticised? And then the HDC, for better or worse, and there are some great policy discussions we could have about, what the best role for the HDC to play might be, but I think they see their role as sort of promoting best practice. And, we often hear from them, outcome is irrelevant. We're not here to criticise people for getting a good outcome or a bad outcome. We just want to know that what you did ticked all of these boxes. And of course, as Sam has just said, the human reality is that, and particularly in a resource-constrained environment, doctors will not always have ticked all the boxes, even if they achieved a good outcome. And so when something gets in front of the HDC and you have people lining up your conduct with all the boxes that need to be ticked, they will find gaps. And I think it is... it's easy to say you need to be resilient, and like Sam said, let it run off like water off a duck's back, as they say. But I think when we're talking about the help that MPS, the medico-legal consultants, the lawyers can provide, it's to help counsel and coach people through trying to get that perspective too. Yeah.
And I think that this highlights that difference between the intellectual response that we might have and the emotional response that we have. And so it's all very well to say, yes, I understand the HDC is doing their job, this is what they're paid to do, and inevitably they'll find something. But the emotional response is, this seems so unfair. Why is this being picked on? And it takes a long time often for those things to kind of merge together and reach a resolution.
And I think that's even more so when the doctor's actually already in a stressful situation, because I do think, that with resource constraints, as Adam was saying, and with the stress of daily life as a doctor in a busy hospital or in a busy practice, you're kind of only just keeping your head above the water anyway, up at night doing your inbox or whatever it is, and then you get the complaint. I think that's part of it. It's actually that the complaint often comes on top of everything else that is causing stress already. Yeah.
And there's the unintended consequences too, aren't there? So if you're criticised for your notes not being complete, then you do the complete reverse. You write, War and Peace for every single consultation you have. And inevitably that means that you actually won't be able to see as many people because, you're spending so much time writing your notes, you don't have the time, or some other aspect of your life will suffer significantly as a result.
Yeah, or you're there till midnight. So the next scenario I wanted to look at is actually vindictive or vexatious complaints, which, to be honest, they are probably the minority, but they definitely are there. And they often create a real feeling of powerlessness for the doctor. And I do think that probably when it's vindictive or vexatious, I think that is often the hardest one to deal with, because often the complainant is actually, sometimes like a dog with a bone that they won't let go of, and there is no reasonable way to deal with it, because actually there is no reasonable basis for the complaint. So I don't know what you think about those situations.
I think the hardest for doctors is when they feel threatened by these patients. They might not feel physically threatened, but they're feeling very emotionally vulnerable. And because of we've all seen those complaints, haven't we, that are just poisonous, and they seem entirely unreasonable. And because patients have a right to complain, it's not like you can stop them from complaining. So I can understand why doctors would feel powerless in that situation. Although that being said, there are things that we can do.
And some complainants really do go to extremes that you just wouldn't imagine. And I'm thinking of one case that we had some years ago that went on for a long, long, long time. And it ended up the complainant, who was actually the parent of the person who was involved, complained about the actions of the MPS lawyer involved in the case. And that lawyer had to then have a lawyer to help defend themselves against the complaint. It was just mind-boggling how far this person wanted to go.
I think in the cases that I run, often I will move to close it down. You can block somebody's email if you need to. You can issue a trespass order. Sometimes I just get a lawyer to send the complainant letters on their own letterhead, so that they come between the complainant and the member that we have.
I think that's a really common way. I'm looking at Adam, thinking of a few that Adam ends up taking the brunt of it, because actually the doctor really can't. There's no way of actually dealing with it. You can't respond. You can't rationalize and resolve it that way. And so sometimes actually by far the best thing is to say, getting a lawyer. So I'm sorry, Adam. These are the ones that we tend to put in your lap to say, can you take over here? It
is one of those cases where I think we can add value. I mean, even if the actual substance of the complaint is in a way is irrelevant, it's the way it's being pursued, or the tone, or the way it's making the doctor feel. If we can write to the person and say, we are acting for this doctor, you can correspond with us. If you send information directly to the doctor, they are not going to read it, they are just going to send it to us. And try and draw all of the fire onto me, essentially. And it's interesting to watch this dynamic play out, because often people, particularly people who, I'm not qualified to make a diagnosis, but I scratch my head sometimes and wonder if some of these people have personality disorders in the really extreme cases. And it feels like that so long as they keep getting a reaction, it's going to keep going. And they can't get a reaction out of me. I can be as methodical and dull and process driven as you like. If you write to me, I will say thank you. I will get back to you in due course. I will get back to them in due course. It'll be very dispassionate, and I can carry that on for as long as a piece of string. And things can fizzle out that way. And even if they don't fizzle out, at least the member is not having that sense of dread or anxiety every time they open their inbox, because they know the problem is being handled. And so I think it is a good strategy if you do have the ability to call in an indemnifier and get a lawyer involved. Can be immensely helpful for those sorts of cases, just to block it off.
Sometimes too, I suggest that the member tell the complainant it's time to go to the HDC. That's one useful thing that the HDC will do. They'll become the intermediary, so that the member doesn't have to deal with the complainant. They just deal with the HDC, and I think it's easier from that point of view.
Yeah, I agree.
Mm. And then, of course, there are ones where actually the doctor is feeling physically threatened. And look, I have had doctors who have had complainants who say, I know where you live, I know where your children go to school. And I think that that's actually really scary for doctors when that happens, and when they're feeling that their physical and their family's physical safety is being threatened.
Yeah, and I would have a low threshold for involving police, even if the police don't do anything. I think just having contacted them and had a file note made is not a bad thing. There are, aside from calling the police and saying, look, I'm actually feeling scared or threatened in this moment, there are two other things that can be done. One is if you've already disenrolled or ceased your therapeutic relationship with a patient, and they're not welcome in your practice anymore, then you can issue them with a trespass notice, and the police can assist with that, so that if they come back onto your property, you can call the police, and there's a very straightforward black and white reason then for the police to be able to remove them and arrest them. Essentially, they're not having to wonder if this is, have they committed an offence. They have, because they were warned off the property and they've disobeyed that warning. The other thing that we sometimes end up doing, not commonly, but it is an option, is that if you're feeling harassed, if someone is actually messaging you on social media or saying things like, I know where you live, make sure you capture that as evidence. Take a screenshot, save it, pass it on to the indemnifier, because if there is a pattern of harassment, and it only needs to be about 3 in a row, doesn't even need to be that close together, then depending on factors that we can assist examining, there may be a case there to obtain what's called a civil harassment order, which is we will go to court and persuade the judge to issue an order that that person cease communicating with you in any way, shape or form, essentially. And if they breach that order, then the police can get involved. So there are things that can be done, and it's good that the system provides those avenues, and they may not be the first thing that comes to mind, that there are those possibilities, but there are, and it's a good reason to seek advice.
The role of social media here, Adam, I can think of a case where terrible outcome, and the doctor involved was getting all kinds of stuff on social media about you murdered my friend, etc., etc. Obviously having a huge impact on the doctor, who felt badly enough about the case anyway, but then this additional stuff coming in.
Yeah, and there's a couple of ways that we can help deal with that. It might be harassing if it's directed and we can get that harassment order. There are also avenues for seeking to have that material taken down that we can assist the member through. And finally, there's always the possibility of considering defamation, either just to use it as a way of saying to the person, look, you are defaming this member and please take steps to stop and remove what you've published. Or at the extreme end, people can choose to sue for defamation. We don't, it's not something that we encourage people to do, because it's a very big to do, and the person you're suing might not have any money, and it doesn't actually help anyone move on. So we're certainly not cheerleaders for it, but it is something that exists in the legal universe as a legitimate thing to raise if someone is defaming you, that they're putting themselves in jeopardy, and it can be a good cudgel to persuade them to stop.
One of the things I just wanted to quickly say about that physical safety thing is companies register, because doctors are often a director of the company, which is often the practice, and often their home address is on the company's register. So I do think if it's something for doctors to think about, just to think about what address is on the company's register, because it's publicly available. And if you're concerned about that I know where you live thing, it's probably a really good thing not to have your home address on the company's register.
Yeah, good advice.
So thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope it's been helpful. Our next podcast will actually be covering some more aspects of this same topic. So we hope you'll tune in for that. And we look forward to catching up with you then. If you like the Medical Protection Podcast, please subscribe and leave a review. If you would like a podcast on a specific topic, please email us on nzpodcasts@medicalprotection.org. So thank you, Tim.
Pleasure, Lucy.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you, Adam. And we'll see you all next time.